Welcome to Construction Cash Flow. I'm your host, Stu Davidson, and if you haven't already done so, hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode.
So for me, what really makes a great leader is someone who's willing to develop their self-awareness and be conscious of what's important to them and the difference they want to make, and is also conscious of how they impact others and how they engage with others, because actually you can't really be an effective leader unless you can build relationships with others, unless you can create circumstances where the others will resonate with you in some shape or form. So emotional intelligence is so important. Sounds like it's a systemic challenge. It's the whole system of how the industry has evolved. And there's something for me when I hear you say about, it's small businesses, livelihoods are at stake, families are at stake. That increases the stress levels enormously. So the potential for triggering, perhaps for being triggered and going into that reactive, emotional or defensive response is increased. People are very action orientated and just want to get it done. And, organizations love those types of personalities. And often they're the people that get promoted. But you've got to think about the people who also are able to engage with others and take people with them, and just focus solely on, we've got to make sure that result happens, that there's a risk they become psychopathic. And they will start developing leaders and attracting leaders in that ilk. I do a lot of work with women leaders, and I know lots of male leaders who are fantastic, and they have daughters, and yet in the organisations they work, they see behaviour from their colleagues that is not okay in terms of how they treat women. I wrote my book about ego because so often ego gets in the way. And our ego, we're in our ego 80% of the time. So that holding back and shrinking back is also our ego in action, because for me, that's all part of our defense strategy, which is all what ego is.
In this show, we ask our guests to tell us their story, tell us a little bit about their background, how they got to where they are today, how they develop their product, their services, their ideas. And we discuss how that can affect construction cash flow and other areas of construction. And also to give us an idea of how we might make things better, and give you a few tips and ideas to take away with you. And listen to the end, where you'll find out more about them, more about our guests, about what motivates them, what inspires them, and hopefully that'll inspire you too. And always, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss another episode. In this episode, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mary Gregory. Mary coaches leaders to play a bigger game and to do it with ease rather than force and control. Mary is a renowned public speaker and is the author of the book Ego. So it's without further ado that it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mary Gregory. So, Mary, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, and thank you for having me here, Stu.
You're welcome. Now, Mary, tell us about your story and how you got to where you are now.
Right, okay. Well, I obviously we could probably be here all day if I told you the whole of my story, but I'll give you a potted version. I think as a child, I always was curious, and I always had this sense of there's got to be more to life than this. I grew up with this kind of aching longing of there has to be more to life than this. And I went in to study psychology. I trained to be an occupational therapist and worked in child and family psychiatry for the first part of my career. But that was only part of who I was. It was a very meaningful role to have. and certainly felt I was making a difference in that role. But working in the NHS back in those days was quite soul destroying as well. So I then kind of went after my more hedonistic side of my life and went into the travel industry and worked overseas as a holiday rep for a couple of years, then got promoted into management, and then very fortunately stumbled across training and development, which was like a marrying of my business skills and development skills that I'd learned as an occupational therapist working in child and family psychiatry. So that led me to then head up learning and development in First Choice Holidays, who are now part of TUI. And from then I went on to create my own business as a leadership coach, a consultant, designing and developing programs, and have worked with all sorts of different organizations, including Tesco, BAA, BAE. And nowadays what I do is I tend, I've been around quite a long time. So I tend to have a mixture of my own clients who come directly to me and work with them as a coach, or work with them helping them develop their teams. They all tend to be in the corporate world or the business world in some shape or form. And I also do associate work through other consultancies as well, which introduces me to all sorts of different clients too. But it's quite interesting because I'm conscious your podcast is towards the construction industry. I did work in the property division at Tesco's for a year, which was really good experience, seeing how very different approach to leadership, also understanding the culture of how the culture of leadership can be impacted, all sorts of things there. Massive learning curve from that experience.
Interestingly, we had Peter Searle on last week. I interviewed.
I would call this a behavioural contract, or sometimes it's called a psychological contract, because it's all about our behaviours, what we need and expect from each other to be our best. It's like it's a systemic challenge. It's the whole system, the web of how the industry has evolved. And there's something for me when I hear you say about, it's small businesses, livelihoods are at stake, families are at stake. That increases the stress levels enormously. So the potential for triggering, for being triggered and going into that reactive, emotional or defensive response is increased.
The way he expressed the structure of Tesco's was really interesting, and the way they worked on a collaborative basis with their supply chain, which was quite adversarial, was in them days anyway.
Yeah. I think what impressed me when I worked there was how relentless they were, and relentless in a good way, in that they would not be stopped by any of the challenges that came up. So like a local authority, they might want to build a Tesco Extra or a Tesco Local or whatever, I can't remember, the Tesco Express. And the local authority say, well, we'll let you do that if you build XYZ in student accommodate. And they'd like, yeah, great, fine, bring it on. And they'd rise to the challenge all the time, incredibly resilient and relentless in how they approach things, and innovative as a result as well.
So what brings the organisations to you? What do they come to you to solve for them?
Okay, well, I'd say these days what people come to me for is usually they are senior leaders. So I work with CEOs, directors. Occasionally I work with people who are heading up leadership roles, so it's kind of heads of. But they're in senior roles, and normally they are navigating some sort of change in some way. I mean, change is ever present in all organizations, and it's becoming more and more complex. So they're usually navigating change in some way. And if I'm honest, usually it's very challenging change, which is impacting them in that they've got a drop of confidence. They may well have lost their mojo a bit. They may well be just questioning themselves. They may be finding some relationships at work quite tricky to navigate. I can think of one client who had quite a challenging time with their CEO, and had to navigate that relationship to get it back on an even course. I also can think of others who've come to me when it's just the size and amount of change they're going through, which can be quite overwhelming. And how I tend to help them is to help, first of all, give them a sounding board to kind of offload everything that's going on in their head, so they kind of get it out there. and then start getting some clarity around what are the important things, what are the priorities for themselves, but also how can they manage themselves in this process? How can they look after themselves so that they can turn up and be their best self, but also how can they get a sense of what's going on around them? And as human beings, we are meaning making machines. So how can they let go of all the meaning they're attributing to things and just deal with what is so, and therefore gain some power and some influence in the situations that they're dealing with? So that's probably a rather long.
It's fantastic.
Your question.
It's really interesting. So, So what do you feel makes a good leader?
Okay, so I take the premise that we are all leaders. So, and the reason I think that, I mean, even children can be leaders. So leaders, anyone who is having an impact or influencing another person, is leading in that moment. And leadership actually takes place in the present moment. It doesn't take place yesterday. It doesn't really take place tomorrow. We can create and inspire about tomorrow, but it happens in the present moment. So for me, what really makes a great leader who's someone who's willing to develop their self-awareness and be conscious of what's important to them and the difference they want to make, and is also conscious of how they impact others and how they engage with others. Because actually you can't really be an effective leader unless you can build relationships with others, unless you can create circumstances where others will resonate with you in some shape or form. So emotional intelligence is so important. So I would put that down as self-awareness and emotional intelligence. I wrote my book about ego because so often ego gets in the way, and our ego, we're in our ego 80% of the time, which is that most of the time we are not aware. We're going on automatic pilot and we're playing all sorts of games all over the place. But as a leader, I personally think you're responsible for actually developing self-awareness, for being a learner. You know, as a leader, you are always learning so that you can keep fine-tuning and becoming as effective as you can be. Because doing the task is tangible and we can get the result from doing the task. Talking about our behaviors and how we interact with each other, I can't necessarily make that connection. But actually, if you don't talk about the behaviors and how you're going to work together, those are the things that could potentially stop you from doing the task. So there is a need to pay attention to both.
So in your book, you talk about under and overinflated egos.
I do.
And when I looked at the list, I was thinking, yeah, I can relate. I've been an overinflated ego and an underinflated ego at the same time.
Yeah,
I seem to tick all those boxes, and one thing that surprised me was I wasn't aware of an underinflated ego. I always thought it was an inflated ego.
Yeah, that's because the ego that gets talked about in the press is all about people with great big egos, you know, and you know, I'm thinking about some famous politicians on both sides of the pond where you might say, yeah, some huge egos there. And that's what often gets talked about. But for me, my interpretation of ego is that it's our defense system. It's how we protect ourselves from social anxiety. And, you know, in the old days, we're out there out there shooting animals, fighting for survival. And it was all fight or flight. And it was very instinctual. But we aren't threatened by, or we're not as threatened as often by really fierce animals, or the threats are very different that we deal with today compared to what we did way back. And I'm thinking Stone Age, man and woman in those days. Nowadays, it's much more about social anxiety, and that all relates to ego because we want to look good. You know, we all have this drive to look good and be seen to be the right person, the nice person sort of thing. And so if there's any threat to that, that causes us anxiety, and that's when our ego comes into play. And therefore, that means we can behave in an overinflated way. So we might, you know, for example, when I get overinflated, I get very controlling and I start telling my partner he's doing things wrong or whatever it is. But then I can also get underinflated. If I'm feeling threatened or intimidated by somebody, I might hold back. So that holding back and shrinking back is also our ego in action, because for me, that's all part of our defense strategy, which is all what ego is.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because you hear a lot these days of people in overwhelm, or fear, anxiety, and maybe self-sabotaging. I'm not good enough, and I see that quite a bit on social media, because I think you see a lot of what people are doing well. Come and have a look, we've achieved this, or this is our new project, or this is another rollout, or this is this, and people only take photos of themselves when they're smiling or they're looking good, and so you kind of look on there and you're kind of thinking, well, it's kind of that kind of you end up with an underinflated ego, because you're not kind of you're comparing yourself with others.
Yes, and really, I mean, the common thread between whether it's overinflated or underinflated is the fact that you feel threatened in some way, and fear has been stimulated for you, and you're doing whatever you're doing to avoid the fear. So, and I think social media, it's so much about ego and looking good, and aren't I having a wonderful time? And underneath, you might be really, not great
Absolutely.
at all.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned about that you're working with organisations, and in the construction industry, we kind of formulate a brand new organisation every time we have a project.
Yeah.
So we're constantly changing who we're working with, and so there is a fear, there is an anxiety, and we're very contractual, and we're thrown together all of a sudden. You mentioned about leadership in the being in the present moment. Would you feel, given a scenario where we're all thrown together for a project, and we've got to kind of negotiate boundaries, if you like, to see where we all fit in, and try and get through it working together, as opposed to ending up in a dispute, which quite often is the case. It's quite a brutal industry at times. How do you see that, comparisons with how the construction industry operates, and a kind of more static organisation, if you like?
Well, I can recall organisations I've worked with. I think BAA, I did some work with a multidisciplinary team that stretched not only internally within BAA, but also externally. Yeah, it was their building division, actually. Now you're mentioning it, now I'm recalling it. And so they worked with architects, they worked with building constructors, all sorts of people who were from outside the organisation. And you can imagine what you have there, because every organisation has its culture, it has its values, and they'll differ. There'll be so much diversity in that, which in one way is a strength, but also has to be managed in order to not to become something that sabotages how people work together. From my perspective, what is invaluable is when a team is coming together, is to actually iron out agreements around expectations and needs. And when I talk about expectations and needs, I'm not talking about, oh, you'll hit my deadline by X, although that is part of it. What I'm talking about is behaviours. So what behaviours do we want to live in this team and bring alive in this team? How will we address differences of opinion, for example, which is a way of being proactive around, because you want differences of opinion. That's how you innovate, is having those differences of opinion, but you don't want it to become sabotaging to the team being able to work effectively through there being so much conflict that all you do is have infighting. So it's about getting in place what I call an agreement or a contract. You mentioned contract. I would call this a behavioural contract, or sometimes it's called a psychological contract, because it's all about our behaviours, what we need and expect from each other to be our best.
That's really interesting. Behavioural contract and agreement. It's not something I've seen in construction generally, and it would help a lot. We tend to be very task oriented.
Yeah, So that is very reflective of how things happen in organizations and businesses, because doing the task is tangible and we can get the result from doing the task. Talking about our behaviors and how we interact with each other, I can't necessarily make that connection. But actually, if you don't talk about the behaviors and how you're going to work together, those are the things that could potentially stop you from doing the task. So there is a need to pay attention to both.
And there is, yeah. And I think you've got a really good point, and I think you could be onto something there, particularly as we are very claims conscious, in construction, and we're very conscious about differences of opinion. Yeah. And how that might affect the rights and obligations of each party, as opposed to initially talking about, how we're going to behave, how we're going to approach a situation where there's two opinions on something, how we're going to approach these situations in contracts, because quite often I feel in construction, contracts are drafted by lawyers for lawyers, and there's grey areas, and it's the grey areas where the lawyers have fun, but everybody else ends up in an argument in the grey areas, because we're not defining, they're the bits we haven't got defined. And so I'm just wondering if that's where the behavioural I'm
not talking so much about a legal contract here. So say you and I chose to work together, and what we agreed was that we would keep each other informed at each stage of the project as to any changes that would occur that might impact the other. And then that doesn't happen. I'm not going to sue you because that hasn't happened. But what I can do is open up a conversation around, Stu, when we started working together, you said that you were going to do this, and I've noticed that this has happened. It's impacting me. You didn't tell me about it. I was surprised to find out about it. And we can have a conversation about it. And the premise for me is that there's a great belief, which is everything is solvable through conversation. So all these conflicts and arguments that can get in place, which can sometimes be inflamed by the legalities, I think, we want to try and ground it in the real behaviours of what do we need to be happening? What are the expectations we have of each other? How can we speak as adults to adult to move the conversation and the situation forward? Rather than starting to try and score points from each other, which is whenever you catch point scoring going on, you're in a game. Whenever you catch hidden agendas, you're in a game. That's why, again, having this sort of open conversation about how do we need to behave with each other, what needs and expectations do we have, right at the beginning, can help you. It doesn't stop it completely because we are an ego so often, but it will reduce the threat of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I totally agree. Where would so when you mentioned about self-awareness, how can we become more self-aware around our fears, anxieties that lead to the various kind of under and overinflated ego, or how do we manage our own ego so that we can identify the egos around us,
Yeah, that is a great question. Well, I think the place to start is with yourself. If you're starting with other people, that's also probably your ego playing up, because you'd rather look at them than you'd look at yourself. The place really is to start with yourself. And a really simple thing you can do, because whenever we lose our rag, and I'm saying getting annoyed or getting upset about something, we're usually triggered in some shape or form. So it's always worth noticing what is the thing that's triggering you, and what can you learn about yourself, about what's really going on underneath that trigger. So what is it that's really upsetting you here? Because sometimes we get triggered by things and we think it's this moment that somebody's done something, but it could be, it could be that you might feel I'm annoyed about the fact this decision's been made, or it could be that decision's been made because you weren't consulted about it. I honestly, there are lots of different answers and lots of different truths to any given scenario. But the important thing is to identify, I'm triggered here. what has triggered me? Is that really the truth of the situation? Is that really what's triggered me? Or is there something else? What am I learning about my own fears and anxieties here? And what is it I really need? So it could be that I just need, like that example I gave you, I just need you to keep me in touch, to keep communicating with me. That's all I need. It could be a really simple thing, but it's a trigger diary as a way, you could do it, have a day where you just are conscious of the things that trigger you and see what you learn from that. That's a step one. You could do it over the course of a week. You could do it for longer. It very much depends on your own motivation. But it will certainly be a great starting point to becoming aware of where your ego gets activated.
Yeah, absolutely. And would we, because we quite often, I think that's great to because some of us, I think some listeners might feel that's a great idea, but perhaps not really knowing where to start with a trigger diary. What's the kind of criteria they need to record, what is it, if we're talking about where our anxieties and linking it to how we behave, do we have kind of columns?
So here's some signs and symptoms of where you might get triggered, and I'm linking this to games, the psychological games we can get into here. So often there's kind of a familiar pattern going on here. So I can remember once, one of my triggers is, not sure how to explain this, but it's almost like it links to my personal story about, I'm second daughter, I'm second best, all that sort of stuff. And I can remember once being in a meeting at work, and the guy who was in charge was asking for people's input, and I immediately put my hand up and started to speak. And somebody else put their hand up and spoke over me, and he listened to that person, and I immediately felt triggered in that moment. And I withdrew. So my ego protected me, underinflated, went immediately into negative self-belief and pushed myself back that, they don't obviously want your opinion. But then I went and spoke to him afterwards because I noticed I was triggered, and I said to him, I'm sorry, but I got triggered in that meeting, and I really felt like I had something to say first, and you pushed me back, and I allowed myself to be pushed back. But I want you to know in future, I want you to acknowledge me. And I actually asked for him, and that for me was a major breakthrough. But what I noticed, the reason I noticed that is it was a repeated pattern for me. So it's whenever you notice something that's familiar, that's like, this is happening again, that is a sign you're being triggered, and it's a sign your ego's going on, and you're getting involved in something that maybe isn't so helpful. In terms of a psychological game. I hope I'm not going into too much detail here, because these are quite sophisticated phenomena we're talking about here. So,
it is. It's fascinating. It's interesting, and I'm sure the listeners will find it interesting, because we're all human beings. We all get triggered, and we all want to be able to lead the companies we're involved in, and actually avoid disputes as well, and be productive and enjoy our work. It should be fun, really. We should enjoy it. It should be creative. It should be fun and less stressful. But quite often we're walking around in a state of anxiety, maybe because we're not paying attention to how we behave, keeping our trigger diary, those sorts of things. And no, I think it's a really interesting subject that perhaps doesn't get aired enough in the sector that we're in.
Well, I can imagine, because I imagine your sector's very, very task focused, and thinking about feelings and triggers and behaviors. That's probably the opportunity there is it's not been accessed enough. There's probably huge potential there to have a positive impact on the sector by allowing some exploration and some expression of those things, really.
Absolutely. And there is a high level of anxiety, I would say, in construction. There is a high suicide rate. It's a seedbed for insolvency, you know,
Yeah.
and slow payments, what this is all about, slow payments and cash flow. And the slow
Yeah.
payments, you know, 95% of the businesses in the supply chain employ less than 5 people. They're quite often, you know, people that have come off trades to develop a business. When they don't get paid, it affects not only their suppliers, which we quite often think about, but it's their families and their bills, the community, you know. So it has much wider reach than just not paying the supplier. It affects the community. It doesn't.
Sounds like it's a systemic challenge. It's the whole system, the web
Yeah,
of how the industry has evolved. And there's something for me when I hear you say about, you know, it's small businesses, livelihoods are at stake, families are at stake. That increases the stress levels enormously. So the potential for triggering, for being triggered and going into that reactive, emotional or defensive response is increased. Which, you know, a lot of the work I do with all my clients actually is we always have a conversation around how they're looking after themselves and their well-being, because that's part of when you imagine, just, you know, if you've not had a good night's sleep, the difference in your performance at work compared to when you have. And that's just one element of your well-being. And if people are in small businesses and their livelihood is under threat because the cash flow, you know, their clients might be withholding payment or whatever, that can have a massive impact on people being vulnerable to their egos playing out. And yeah, I'm not surprised that, you know, suicide rate. So suicide is often seen from a psychological framework as unexpressed anger. So it's kind of, you know, the whole emotional field is so important to become more aware of your feelings and what's important to you and what do you need to address the negative feelings. Because, you know, if your needs are met, we feel joy and happiness. When they're not met, we feel anxiety, anger, sadness. And being able to recognize that means you're then put in a position of greater choice around how you deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I found really interested in your book, Ego, was when you talked about the pathology of organizations, and in a way construction and that whole culture that, you know, you were just describing around construction and that we're aware of, it becomes, you know, that supply chain, that grouping of companies, people come together and form an organization, and it might be ad hoc, but it comes together. And you know, there is a certain pathology around. It's a little. It seems in certain respects a bit dysfunctional from construction, and you know, it was you talk about an organisation being having a kind of psychopathic tendencies. I mean, where would you see that construction organisation on that kind of scale?
I think I suppose my sense of it is that the challenge is that when we lose balance, and what I see happening, and we're going back to this task behavior piece, that when there is an over focus on task and results, and I'm not saying organizations should not be interested in results. Of course, they should be interested in results. It's the responsible thing to do, is to achieve the results they want to achieve. But it's the how they go about achieving them that's important. So when they lose sight of how they go about achieving them and don't pay attention to that and just focus solely on, we've got to make sure that result happens, that there's a risk they become psychopathic, and they will start developing leaders and attracting leaders in that ilk. Whereas actually what you need as an organization, and I think this applies to any industry, is, you know, an organization is only a collection of human beings. You know, we call it an organization and immediately it becomes organization. It becomes kind of this monolithic monster, you know, this commodity. People are not commodities, they're people. And the best way to engage people is to treat them as human beings, and to treat them with respect, to treat them, dare I say, in the corporate world, in the construction world, to treat them with a bit of love and TLC. All really, really important stuff. Because, you know, you wouldn't. I do a lot of work with women leaders, and I know lots of male leaders who are fantastic, and they have daughters, and yet in the organizations they work, they see behavior from their colleagues that is not okay in terms of how they treat women, and yet they're caught up in that culture, so they don't address it because it's hard to address. So that we get these cultural norms, and if the cultural norm is just about results and not about the people, I think you're going to have a tricky time on your hands. I think particularly as we go forward, and the trend going forward, and you're looking at the younger generations coming through, is that, you know, then the younger generation, particularly millennials and Generation Z that are coming through, are not patient. If they're not treated well and with respect, they'll be off. And, you know, we already have an employment issue in this country, with not enough people to fill all the posts that we want to fill. As an organisation, you've got to start paying attention to the people side and to the human side as much as you pay to the results. And your way to get those great results is through your people. I've just gone on the soapbox there, so sorry about that.
And I totally agree. You know, having you know, running my business over the years, I've realised that it is all about the people. You know, it's being able to. They're your best asset. You can change bits of machinery, and you can change buildings, and you know, but people are the one thing that changes the business. And I think, you know, quite often, you know, it's always referred to as looking after people as so-called soft skills. And, you know,
soft skills, which are the hard skills, actually.
Exactly.
They're the tricky ones. They're the really tricky ones to develop. Is this, particularly if you're someone who is very, very, I mean, we talk about different personality types, and there's people that are very action orientated and just want to get it done. And, you know, organizations love those types of personalities, and often they're the people that get promoted. But you've got to think about the people who also are able to engage with others and take people with them, because you don't want your leaders all running ahead to turn around and find that no one's there with them. Otherwise, you're not going to deliver anything.
Exactly. And how do you feel that we could, you know, particularly in the construction industry, improve our soft skills? You know, how do we kind of become a little bit more self-aware, and how do we kind of perceive how we're responding in relationship to others? Yeah.
Well, we've talked already about keeping that trigger diary as a way of getting self-aware. The other way is to start asking for feedback, and you don't necessarily have to. You could do a formal 360 feedback process, but you could do something quite informal as well. Just email half a dozen people and make sure it's a mixture of people, not just the people that you get on famously with, and ask them, what are the qualities they see in you? What do you do that works as a leader? What do you do that you could improve on? And just ask them for that feedback, and then see what things come back. That's a really simple way to start building your self-awareness. And then once you've got that, that's a message about the impact you're having on others, because what people will tell you is the way you impact them. And then once you can see that, you can then start thinking a bit more about, oh, right, so people think I interrupt too often. Okay, maybe I should work on my listening skills. And there's all sorts of things you could do around that. Or maybe I should work on being more empathetic, or whatever it is. It depends what comes back from the information you get. But that's some practical things you could do very easily.
Oh, that sounds really, I'm going to try that actually. The trigger diary, although it probably needs some guidance, because as you say, they're soft skills, but they're hard soft skills. So there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
There are, and it's very multi-leveled.
How do you interpret the feedback? What do I do with the diary once I've got it? You know, lots of things like that. So when's the best time for an organisation or somebody in a leadership role to come and find you and say, look, Mary, you know, we may need some help with this?
Well, ideally, the earlier the better. So, for example, if you're a leader individually and you're stepping up in the organisation, maybe you're taking on a new role or a new challenge, that's a good time to get in touch with me. As an organisation, if you know that you're navigating change, or if you can see that, you know, sometimes I get approached by organisations who are in the startup phase and they want to develop a positive culture, and I can work with them to help them identify. So that contracting phase that I talked with you about, where you identify the behaviours that would really make this a great place to work, and how are you going to hold each other to account for those behaviours? How are you going to make sure that those behaviours are really brought alive? And it starts with the leaders at the top, because how the leaders at the top, think about being a senior leader, which for some people is off-putting. They don't want to get to that stage. But for those that are in those senior leadership roles, you are more visible than you recognise. And therefore, the way you act and behave has a massive impact. And you are the role models to the rest of the organisation as to how we do things around here. So you have an awful lot of influence over culture. So if you're in that stage of wanting to shift the culture, I can help with that. But also, if you're in the stage of where you're starting out and starting up, I can help with creating the culture as well.
So what's the best way for somebody to get in contact with you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, so probably via LinkedIn. That's how you and I met, actually, is the easiest way. So via LinkedIn, or I have a website, which is marygregory.com. So just www.marygregory.com. You can contact me, send me a message via my website. And also there's a free download on my website. If you want the chapter of my book, you can download the first chapter from my website as well. Yeah.
And I'll put some of those links in the notes to the podcast as well. So when people listen to the podcast, they can look at it and click on there. And the book is amazing, and I would recommend that to anybody that is in a leadership role, or aspiring to a leadership role, or going through change.
And I'm very happy to offer free copies of the book to your first 5 sign-ups as well, Stu. So
thank you so much, Mary. So everyone, if you want a copy of Mary's book, the first 5 that subscribe to the channel, we'll send you, you give us your details, we'll send you out a copy of Mary's book. So Mary, time for a quick fire inspiration motivation.
Okay, oh my goodness. Now my ego, so talk about social anxiety, my ego suddenly gone, oh, God, what if I get it wrong? And what if I make a fool of myself? All of those things are going through my head. But here goes. Let's just see what happens.
Fantastic. There's no right or wrong in this round. It's just whatever comes to mind, and it's nice and gentle. So, first question: how do you start your day?
Okay. I start my day. Usually, I start my day by going downstairs. I have hot water and lemon, and I go. And if it's warmer days, I go out in my garden and I look at my garden and connect with nature. And if it's freezing cold, I will probably just look at it through the window and just worry about how it's going to be in the spring. But I connecting with nature is really important to me. So that's how I set myself up for the day. Quiet time.
When are you most productive?
I am most productive in the mornings, so I frequently get up early and start work quite early as well. So 7 or 8 o'clock, you might find me at my desk, but that's only because I like to have that time to reflect, to think, but also I'm at my most creative then as well.
What's something new happening in your life right now?
Something new happening in my life. Oh gosh. Well, okay, I'll talk about things that are happening in my business, actually. So this year I've committed to raising my profile. So I'm doing a weekly Monday Magic, I've called it, which is just setting ourselves up for the week, because Monday can be a real, oh God, I'm back at work. And so what I've done is I'm sharing only for about a 5-minute live on LinkedIn every Monday, just reflecting on how did last week go, and then setting an intention for how you want this week to go. And I share any inspiration or anything I've read or watched or seen that is helpful to support us with setting ourselves up well for the week. So that's one thing I'm doing. And I'm also running a monthly leadership live, which is a free webinar, 45-minute webinar every month, where we cover all sorts of topics. This month, actually, we've got something happening this month on how ego affects our success, how we can sabotage ourselves, but also how ego can support us to be successful as well. Next month, we're doing something around women and ego, because it's International Women's Day next month. So and that's kind of evolving as the year goes on.
What does adventure look like to you?
Oh, adventure. Well, I'm quite an adventurous person, and actually adventure is one of my values. So I like to have adventures. And I do believe that life is one long experiment. So, you try things out. Does it work? Does it not work? How was that experience? Adventure can be in the moment, just getting curious about something and trying something out. So it can actually take place in my office here. I'm having an adventure right now. Maybe I'm having an adventure talking to you. Or it can be something much grander than that or bigger than that. Can be, I do a lot of cycling with my partner, and we have friends that we go away on holidays with and cycle all over the place. That always sets up my sense of adventure. Sort of being in the great outdoors and in the fresh air always feels adventurous, and trying new cultures and new experiences.
What thing would you love to do that might surprise your friends and family?
Do you know, I don't know. I saw that in your list and I thought, I just haven't a clue on that one, because I think they're kind of a bit unsurprised by me, because I'm just kind of, oh, she's at it again sort of thing. I think I'm going to have to pass on that one for now. I can't think of anything.
You'll think of something after the podcast.
Probably.
Name a challenge you overcame that changed your life.
A challenge I overcame that changed my life. I think, and I'm going to share this because I talk to women leaders about this a lot, but also it applies to male leaders as well. Learning to say no and put my boundaries down in a clear way. And I still sometimes have a sense of awkwardness when I do that, but I also know how important it is, because I've had times in my life where I've not been good with boundaries, to quite devastating effects, actually. So yeah, learning to say no has absolutely helped me rise up and be a much stronger person and much more able to contribute effectively to others.
Yeah, actually, I totally agree with that one. That's one with me. Say no more. Yeah, absolutely agree with that one.
I have to transcend my ego to do that, because I'm getting more used to it, but I still have to sometimes take a deep breath and go, no, I'm not going to go with that, and it's because my ego is going, oh, just be nice to people, or just say yes because it'll stop there being an argument or whatever. But no,
What inspires and motivates you?
Oh gosh, all sorts of things inspire and motivate me. I've already mentioned connecting with nature. I find very energizing and inspiring, but people inspire me all the time. I'm really passionate about helping people lead their best lives and make the optimum contribution they can make. But I'm privileged and honored to work with some incredible leaders, and some of the things that they do I'm absolutely awed by. It's really incredible to hear what they do, and I'm certainly inspired by my clients. But yeah, lots and lots of things inspire me, but lots of things that people do particularly inspire me when they're contributing massively and impacting others in such a positive way.
What does success mean to you?
Success means, what it means to me is making a positive contribution in some shape or form. And that doesn't have to be huge. It can be just in a tiny form as well. But the fact that you're touching people in some shape or form and making a contribution, the fact you might have grown some bulbs and they've come through, that looks like, you know, so I think success shows up in all sorts of shapes and forms. Leading a happy life that's positive and makes a difference to others and to the planet, I think, is success for me.
So we come to the final question. What advice would you give to your young self?
Advice to my younger self, to care less in a way. And I suppose what I mean there is, I think we hold ourselves back, and I'm completely guilty of this, because we don't want to look silly or foolish. And actually, it doesn't really matter. You know, some years ago, I came to the conclusion, if nobody dies, does it really matter? You know, if it's going to really hurt somebody, fine, that's fair enough. But otherwise, give it a go. You know, all you can lose is a bit of face, really. So, to care less about what others think.
Thank you, Mary. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. There's so many things that we can learn from the work you do, and the book is amazing, and I just recommend that book to anyone listening. So thank you so much, Mary, and maybe you'll come on again soon.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you so much, Stuart. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Construction Cash Flow. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so you never miss an episode. And remember, the faster cash flows, the faster wealth grows.